Good evening, everyone. We really want to welcome you to our last webinar. I really enjoy all the webinars, and I think we have a very good final. So I'm looking forward this evening because I think this is a really important topic we will finish. Unfortunately, the war is still going on, but we will continue with our work with World Psychologists and PsyGlobal, and together with friends of Psychologists and PsyFlix, we hope maybe in the late summer we have more things we will share with you. But for now, we want to say welcome to Paul Woolen and to Alashet. First, I want to say, Alashet, I want to give you some time to say something. You are a psychologist from Kiev, from Ukraine, and you're right now in Spain. And you also, because of the war, you are an expert, beside of psychologist, you are an expert for the Council of Europe. You're one of the helpers to set up this webinar series together with Friends of Psychologists. So that was a really good start to move forward. And also you're connected to the Israeli Drama Coalition. So to you, Alla.
Thank you, Wendy, very much. It's a great honor for me to take a floor on this webinar. But first of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to the Dutch Foundation Friends of Psychologists, which is one of the organizers for these webinars, and which I have known since 2011, and whose experts have been worked in Ukraine to provide psychosocial support for penitentiary staff in juvenile correctional institutions. They were worked like volunteers, and I'd like to say especially thanks to Gerda van Hof and Marijka van Genabik. I hope they are here, but I don't see you. And also I'd like to appreciate Foundation World Psychologists, PsyGlobal and PsyFlix for organizing these webinars that provide professional support in this horrible for Ukraine time. It seems to me that we really don't realize the scale of the disaster. The impact of trauma that people incur is still beyond our understanding. This war destroyed whole cities, separated millions of families, killed a lot of civilians and Ukrainian militaries. This war stole childhood from all kids in Ukraine. And you know, now the questions for Ukrainians, how are you doing, becomes very difficult. I am a refugee, and I escaped from Kiev in the beginning of March with my daughter and her infant. My husband stayed in Kiev, and I don't know when I'll be able to see him. We had plans, we wished to celebrate our anniversary of wedding, but everything was destroyed. And being in a beautiful Spain, I have a problem with enjoying this beauty. And if you ask me how I am doing, you know, I have a huge hole in my soul. Like a football field, like most of Ukrainians, and sometimes it seems that that this war stole our future, and this war.
Take your time, Ella.
Sorry.
No worries.
This war totally changed the life of all Ukrainians, and it seems to me that the traumas will continue for generations to come. And of course, no one who in the 21st century was not ready for such unhuman war against the Ukrainian population. And I'd like to say a couple of words about one important strategy within the Council of Europe project. After the first intervention of Russian Federation, I was with Israel Trauma Coalition in the eastern part of Ukraine, and we, being in one of the religious center where internally displaced persons were hidden, an Israeli expert asked, "What should you do if Russians start a new intervention?" People were shocked. What did he mean? Did he predict Russian intervention? Or why did he ask this question? He asked about our preparedness for any stressful situation. It doesn't matter what stress will knock to our door. It might be widespread violence, grief, natural disaster, industrial accident, or terrorist attack. Everything is shared community responsibility. Individuals, families, business, and institutions that prepare before an emergency are more likely to endure, to reduce the damage it causes, and to recover faster. And now we understand that resilience is the ability to cope and become strong, healthy, and successful again after crisis. And in our country, thanks to the First Lady, Olena Vladimirovna Zelenskaya, she started building and developing a resilient system on a state level. And we are optimistic. I like the phrase, everything will be okay in the end. If it is not okay, it is not the end. And during this war, we created a new slogan, everything will be Ukraine. And the topic that were raised today is very, very important for us. It means it helps us how to survive, how to find a sense of their life, and how to help others, how to help with this total grief that is surrounding us. Thank you, Mr.
Yeah, thank you, Ala, for your important words and the courage of sharing your own experience as well with us and the emotions that are part of it, logically. Yeah. So Ella, you will stay with us till the end. So if people have questions for you, they can ask them on the Q&A. Wendy and I will be the host today. Wendy is from World Psychologists and I'm from PsyGlobal, and we will try to take care of all the questions you might have. Our speaker of today is Paul Boelen. We're very happy that he is with us today. He's a professor at the Department of Clinical Psychology at Utrecht University. And he also works as a psychotherapist at ARC Centrum 45. And well, he does a lot of research on grief. And I think we can say he's the expert on traumatic grief in the Netherlands. So we're very proud that he is here with us on in this last webinar. Paul, can I give you the word?
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for your important words, Ala, to start this webinar with. Thanks again for inviting me to talk on grief today in the 6th webinar. It's a hot, sunny day, and I'm here in the attic of our house, and it's very warm, so I may be opening and closing doors if it's get noisy, but we'll see. There's a lot to talk about. So there's a lot to address if we talk about grief. Today, I made a selection to address the following issues in the upcoming hour or so, or a short hour. I'm going to talk about characteristics of grief, the nature and prevalence of emotional distress following loss, about the assessment of prolonged grief disorder, which is a novel disorder included in the DSM-5 text revision and the ICD-11, risk factors, a CBT approach. I will touch upon that, the theoretical underpinnings of understanding persistent bereavement-related distress from the CBT approach. I will zoom in on interventions and effects of CBT treatment, and also address some additional topics and some final remarks. Before I start, my background is in the area of research on complicated grief, prolonged grief, and psychotraumatology, mostly focused on adults in our Western society. So most of my research and expertise is also based on that, and most of what I will talk is based on that work. And what I try to do, of course, is to make some translation to the situation of war and multiple loss and trauma. But of course, it's also up to you in the audience to make that translation, and it's also to say that not everything will be equally applicable to all your situations. But having said that, I do think that there are some general rules of thumb or some general tips and advices that things we apply in CBT treatment that can also be applied in all sorts of bereavement care. So first, some misconceptions about grief. I will not go into detail. In fact, I will address many topics today quite rapidly, but I do find important to start with this. There are a lot of misconceptions about what is grief. There are a lot of misconceptions about a normal grieving. And for instance, there's still a popularity, or I have to remove my own image here. Okay, there's still the Kubler-Ross model of grief running through stages and phases is still very, very popular. So this stage model holds that there's first denial, then anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So the basic notion of these stage models of grief is that grief runs in the same types of stages for all, if not everyone. And this is a misconception. If you look at large groups of people, you may see something like this phase model going on, but it doesn't hold for every individual bereaved person, of course, I'd say. But still, it's quite popular, this model, and it tends to get a sort of a prescriptive model. So I still come across, or I still meet with people who went to a bereavement counselor, who compared their grieving process with this DAPDA model of Kubler-Ross, and were telling them that they were grieving wrongly. So that's not the way we should, of course, use this stage model. We cannot say that every grieving process runs in these same stages. We also cannot say that the same reactions, anger, depression, sadness, are always part of the grieving process, or that intense emotional responses in the initial period intense emotions are wrong or good. We do know, and I will get back to that later on, that the more intense emotions are in the immediate period following the loss, the more intense the emotions tend to be later on. We can also not say that losing a child is always worse than losing a partner. And we can also not say that the grieving process always ends after a year or 2 years when it comes down to children. There are no such general universal rules. And it's good to be aware of that, because a lot of what we do, I think, in bereavement care is also giving psychoeducation and also correcting all kinds of wrong ideas that people may have about their own bereavement and grieving process. So it's good to be aware that some of our grieving clients and patients may be suffering from these types of misconceptions. And there's a nice paper by Mickey Strebe and Henk Schut that addresses this in more detail if you want to read it. So if we talk about grief, we shouldn't say it's all about stages. I find it important to highlight that at the heart of grief, the core of grief, is separation distress. So as I will talk about later on in more detail, grief resembles or looks a lot like some other responses. We see anxiety, depression, but at the heart of grief, we see a different type of response. Grief is primarily about separation distress, an attachment response following the separation, the irreversible separation from an attachment figure. And this is all about normal grief and acute grief and prolonged grief. So I'm not exclusively talking about prolonged grief disorder here. So separation distress manifests itself in yearning and longing and in proximity-seeking behaviors, in preoccupation with thoughts of the deceased and circumstances of the death event. The experience that the deceased person is seen or heard, feeling that the separation is unreal. These are all experiences connected with separation distress, with acute separation distress. So this is at the heart of grief. And adjusting to loss, we just saw it's not about stages or phases. We can better say that grieving is about accomplishing a number of tasks. Working through processing loss is about facing the reality of the loss, allowing emotions to be felt, and continuing usual valued activities. I will return to that in a moment. And again, explaining this very simple model in terms of tasks helps people to understand or enhance their understanding of the process that they are going through. Loss and trauma have similarities. They're both negative, stressful life events, disruptive life events, but they're not equal. They're not similar experiences. So loss experiences, bereavement loss, but also non-bereavement loss, are about separation from someone or something that you're attached to. And the responses to such losses include separation distress, difficulties to accept and believe that the object or the person you're attached to is gone. And in trauma, we speak of trauma when people experience or witness an event that's threatening to one's safety, control, integrity, health of self and others. And traumatic distress is characterized by anxiety and hypervigilance and a sense of ongoing threat. So these are different events leading to different responses. And of course, there can be instances, many instances, in fact, also in the context of war, where loss occurs in the context of traumatic event, or traumatic events are accompanied by loss of loved ones. And then we see an interplay of both grieving, separation distress, and traumatic distress. So talking about the nature and the prevalence of emotional distress following bereavement, first about the nature. Some studies have been done which have tried to gain clarity about the prevalence of emotional problems. There are mixed studies using mixed outcome measures, so we see mixed findings, but very roughly, you can say that about 50% of bereaved people show a resilient pattern of stable, healthy functioning. About 40% responds with initially high symptoms or severe symptoms, but recovers, and approximately 10% suffers from chronic distress. And these numbers, again, are based on different studies, so they differ a bit across studies, but well, this is a safe direction. And if we say this 10%, what do these people suffer from? They mainly suffer from prolonged grief disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and or depression. Those are the key symptoms that we see in this 10%, not the only symptoms, but the key symptoms. And recently, or over the last couple of years, researchers have tried to raise clarity about the nature of unhealthy or disordered grief responses. And this has accumulated in the inclusion of prolonged grief disorder now in the text revision of the DSM-5. And their prolonged grief disorder is defined as you see here on the slide. So at least 12 months must have passed after the loss, and then people have to experience longing, yearning, preoccupation, so the separation distress symptoms, combined with avoidance, pain, difficulties moving on, and different other symptoms to qualify for prolonged grief disorder. And of course, in blue, the symptoms have to be distressing and disabling and have to exceed social, cultural, and religious norms. A lot of us also work with ICD-11, the WHO system, that uses also the term prolonged grief disorder and also uses the same criteria roughly, but there's a big or important distinction there, and that PGD can already be diagnosed after 6 months in this ICD system. But looking at the symptoms, they're roughly similar, although the yellow or the yellow blocks here are the additional symptoms defined in the ICD-11. But again, at the heart of the prolonged grief disorder is the persistence of separation distress to a distressing and disabling degree. zooming in on that a little bit more, I said before that prolonged grief disorder has similarities with depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, but there are also quite some important differences that are summarized here on this slide. I will not read them out all, but to highlight but a few. The emotional experiences. In PGD, it's really about separation distress. In PTSD, it's about anxiety. And I like that phrase from the Ehrlich and Clark model. It's really about a sense of ongoing current threat. That is what characterizes PTSD. And in major depression, we see this lack of positive affect, anhedonia, depressed mood, which is qualitatively different from what we see in PGD and PTSD. In terms of intrusive images in people with PGD, we see that they suffer from painful recollections of the lost person. These may be positive recollections, but immediately connected with an intense pain, with the realization that the other person is gone. In PTSD, we see this anxiety-driven and anxiety-laden reliving experiences, traumatic circumstances. So these are other differences. The timing is interesting. We're quite conservative when it comes down to PGD. You can only diagnose that after 6 months in ICD-11 and 12 in DSM, whereas we know that PTSD you can already diagnose a lot earlier. All right. Saying a little bit more about the distinction of PGD compared to normal grief, I like this dual process model, which is also a very illustrative, clear model that you can use to explain what grief constitutes when you want to explain that to clients and patients. So normal grief, this model says it's all about oscillating between focusing on the loss, processing the loss on the one hand, and also restoration, working towards a new future, adjusting your meanings and future perspectives, etc. So this oscillation is the normal way of grieving. And in PGD phenomenology, well, if you look at people with PGD, we see either a fixation on this loss orientation, and in a minority of people, we see the fixation on the restoration. They deny the loss and want nothing else but to move on. So this is a further illustration of the difference between PGD and normal grief. I said a little bit about that. So we have there are many instances in which people are confronted with loss in the context of traumatic events, or traumatic events bringing loss, and there, in some of these people, we see this interplay, this combination of PTSD and PGD, or stated in other words, this interplay between separation distress and traumatic distress. So people are preoccupied with the lost person. Everything is a reminder of the lost person. And on the other hand, they're also reliving the traumatic circumstances. And they have difficulties to understand the belief that the danger is in the past. So some, if not many, of the clients who suffered loss, multiple loss in the context of war, have both these types of responses: separation distress and traumatic distress. So we can now formally diagnose or code. I forgot to put DSM-5-TR in the middle column, but we can now formally code prolonged grief disorder, which is an acknowledgement that some people continue to suffer from severe grief, and also helps for the reinsurance reimbursement in some of the countries we work in. Assessing PGD in clinical practice. Now, I'm well aware that we're not all working in mental health care. We're working, you in the audience, in different areas and different branches, but I still say, if you want to know about the intensity of the grief, I'd say don't hesitate to try to diagnose it, or don't hesitate using self-report instruments to assess the grief. Grieving is in its core a normal response, but still some people get stagnated, suffer intensely. And if you want to know more about the nature of their symptoms and the intensity, I'd say don't hesitate to use questionnaires to diagnose that.
Paul, can I ask you something?
Yeah.
It's quite a difference, the 6 months or the 12 months.
Yes.
What do you think is best to use, or what's your opinion on that?
Good question. I'd say it's better to, well, if people seek help in the first half year or even before that, I wouldn't send them home and say, come back when the 12 months have passed. So I'm more in favor of the 6 months threshold, because we know also from research, I referred to that earlier, if people have this intense grieving response in these first couple of months, they tend to, well, continue to have that intense grieving response over the upcoming few years. So you can, I think, start intervening quite early in this process.
Yeah.
So if you want to know more about the distinction, what we tend to focus on in our clients is the degree of progress in the grieving process. The difference between healthy grief and PGD is that in PGD people really show no progress. The duration of the grieving process, well, formally it's 1 year. We use DSM, but as we said just a couple of seconds earlier, I would not, well, again, if people in the first half year or around the period of 6 months already maintain this unchanged intense response, then I would also start giving care, start giving care. And of course, the degree of suffering, which is a distinction or an important criterion in many disorders. So in PGD or subclinical PGD, people really suffer from this intense grief distress that impairs functioning, and loss usually impairs functioning, but in people with severe PGD, you really see that they can think of nothing else but the deceased person, or are only preoccupied with the loss and the circumstances. Well, if you want to assess this more formally, you can use a self-report questionnaire and use a clinical interview. I will not address that, not the clinical interview, which is beyond the scope, but I want to refer to this instrument we've been developing, which is called the Traumatic Grief Inventory Self-Report plus the TGI-SR plus. So over the years, there have been different sets of criteria proposed for DSM-5 and for DSM-5-TR and for ICD-11. So in clinical practice in different countries, different sets of criteria are still actually being used, and this questionnaire allows for the assessment of all these different criteria sets, including ICD-11 and DSM-5-TR. It's a self-report questionnaire, and a score of 71 or higher is indicative of clinically relevant PGD. On the Open Science Framework, type in TGI-SR plus Open Science Framework, you find different translations. And in the next couple of days, we will also upload the Ukrainian and the Russian version on the OSF and on traumameasuresglobal.com. Together with some wonderful colleagues, we've been able to translate the questionnaire in Russian and Ukrainian. So it's ready for use. The nature and the prevalence, I said something about that before. With the stopping lights, there are different numbers going around in the literature. There are two prevalence studies or reviews of prevalence studies have been conducted. One indicated that 9.8% of people following a natural loss suffer from probable PGD. And in a review we did ourselves, among people who suffered unnatural losses due to homicide, suicide, accident, war-related violence, almost 1 in 2, 49.5% suffered from intense PGD. Not the full-blown disorder, but rates were considerably higher among those who had suffered unnatural loss. And why am I showing this? Because I want to apply caution in this. I'm not saying that 1 in 2 people suffer from PGD. The point here is that this unnatural loss events, traumatic loss events in the context of war, for instance, render a person more prone to PGD. What I also find important to say in this context is that not only PGD can occur following loss, of course, I'd say, but the unexpected death of a loved one can also set in motion or precipitate several or many different other disorders. So this wonderful study in the US showed that, for instance, among people between 60 and 65 who suffered a sudden loss, well, these people had a 7 times increased chance of suffering a first depression or a first period of alcohol abuse. So the point here is that sudden deaths, which happen, of course, in wartime, not only set in motion the chance or render a person prone to PGD, but also render a person vulnerable to different other types of emotional disorders. So it's good to be aware of that. So a bit of a conclusion for this part: the trajectory of stable, healthy functioning, which we tend to call resilience, is the rule, not the exception. So again, if we look at different studies using slightly different criteria, different groups, this is a safe conclusion. The majority of people show this trajectory of stable, healthy functioning. Approximately 10% problems. Sudden loss precipitates the start of many other problems alongside PGD, PTSD, and depression. Of course, there are specific modes of death and circumstances of the death that may increase the chance of additional symptoms. So if one is considered co-responsible, or one is feeling guilty, blames himself, then of course guilt and self-blame are feature prominently in the complaints. If others are held accountable, anger, bitterness, and rage may, of course, dominate the symptom picture. I'd say use the TGI if you want to assess grief. You don't medicalize grief if you have people complete the questionnaire, just like you can use the PHQ to assess depression and the PCL5 to assess PTSD. And these measures are all also available from trauma measures. Global.com. So risk factors, again, the stopping light. If we look at this, what are the people that have a increased chance of ending up in this red line, ending up with chronic grief, chronic distress? And again, I'm a scientist, so I have to say this: there's not much knowledge on that. Of course, studies have been done, but studies have been done with different criteria, so we have to be a little cautious in saying something about risk factors. So there's an increased chance for women, people with lower education, and also with a vulnerable socioeconomic status. What are a little bit more stronger risk factors are aspects of the lost relationship. We know from bigger studies that losing a child or losing a partner gives a greater chance of problems compared to people who are more at a distance. Of course, the time since loss is not a very important correlate of the intensity of grief. So again, we see intense PGD after 3 months, we see intense PGD after 20 years. It's not strongly correlated with time, so time doesn't heal wounds in everybody, at least. Personality vulnerabilities play a role. So people who are vulnerable are already prone to mental health care problems or physical health problems, are also more vulnerable to suffer from prolonged grief or other problems following loss. The suddenness and the untimeliness of losses are features of the loss event that increase the chance of prolonged grief disorder. And also there may be instances in which people die and in which the deceased person might have suffered. So in the case of war or homicide, perhaps the deceased had suffered tremendously before he or she died, or suffered torture, for instance. And those instances, almost needless to say, those extra traumatizing instances, of course, inflate the PGD and inflate the PTSD. This schema depicts the following: that in case of traumatic losses, which I tend to focus on tonight, you see this interplay of different groups of risk factors. So people lose an attachment figure, which is already devastating in itself. If that's in the context of war, or violence, or whatever the unnatural causes, there are traumatizing aspects of the loss that are horrific and shattering in themselves. Traumatic losses, war, suicide, homicide bring about a whole bunch of events, stressful events in the aftermath of a loss that in themselves may be traumatizing and devastating. So here we see different groups, different categories of risk factors that work in concert, work together to inflame the risk of intense grief. And then there's other factors like media attention, personality style, the legal consequences, the absence or presence of social support, which you have to take into consideration.
And Paul, is there also a difference between sexes and children, men, women?
Yeah, so if you look at the large groups of people, some women tend to score higher on scales for PGD, for what it's worth. So women have a slightly increased chance of getting stuck in their process of grieving. And talking about risk factors in the context of war, on top of what I touched upon, there are many other contextual factors that, of course, inflate the current stress and well, stagnate the grieving process. So there's the ongoing stresses of war. There are damaged communities with obviously interfere with social support. There's loss of material human capital. There's a lot of uncertainty about the future in war times. Sometimes people are confronted with multiple loss or disappearances of loved ones. So of course, this intensity, this interplay of many different stressors inflates the risk of grief, separation distress, traumatic distress, and depression. So that's what I said. Many different factors affect responses to loss. I think that mapping or disentangling this together with your client or patient or someone seeking counseling with you, doing that together, trying to draw this picture together of all the risk factors or all the factors that, in the case of your client, amplifies the problem. I think that's an important thing to do in therapy, because of a lot of what we do in bereavement counseling and care is try to disentangle all the things that people experience and to disentangle the different losses that they experience, the different feelings that are connected with the losses and the different stressors they've encountered. So drawing this picture, the scheme together with your client is, I think, a valuable thing to do. I'm moving to the CBT approach, which we've been studying in Utrecht quite a lot. Again, primarily for Western people seeking help in the Netherlands, which is, well, of course, colors a bit of what I'm talking about, but still, I think a lot of what we have learned is applicable to many different groups and people having lost loved ones in many different contexts. So starting here, you can say that PGD, prolonged grief, persistent acute grief, is almost a bit like a puzzle. On the one hand, people are preoccupied with the loss and the circumstances of the loss. They're obsessed by it almost, but on the other end, they also experience this persistent disbelief. They cannot believe or accept or really grasp that the loss is final, that the loss and the separation is irreversible, and that manifests itself in separation distress and yearning, and also this fixation on the past and the inability to focus on the future. And the CBT perspective, this draws heavily from CBT models for traumatic stress. But for acute grief, one can say from this perspective that acute grief becomes chronic because the irreversibility of the loss, the reality of the loss, is insufficiently integrated or connected with the grieving person's self-identity, work model of the relationship, and the worldview. The person develops persistent negative cognitions that maintain the grief, and the person tends to engage in avoidance behaviors that maintain the grief. So these are three key processes that I will zoom in on a little more in the next few minutes. So in referring to the first process, in persistent acute grief or in PGD, what we see is something like that this external reality, the death of a loved one, tends to remain disconnected from this internal reality. So people have working models of the relationship, have ideas and assumptions about their identity and roles, perceptions about the world as being a safe place, or at least predictable or benign to some extent. And then the death of loved ones and the traumatizing death of loved ones doesn't fit in with this internal reality. And as long as this internal and external reality are not connected, not integrated, the separation distress and the panic and the disbelief and the traumatic distress tend to persist. And the implication of this for treatment, and I will focus on interventions in a couple of minutes from now, the implications for treatment are that it's very important to talk about and address this reality, to really expose a person to the fact that the loss happened, that the loss is irreversible. And it sounds simple, and in itself, it's a basic and quite simple principle. Really addressing the loss, addressing the painful details is critical to good bereavement care. And this can be done in writing assignments, and we can use also therapeutic rituals to foster this confrontation with the reality of the loss. Why am I now at the end? This is not where I want to be. Sorry for that. Touched the wrong button. Exposure, as I said, we can distinguish different types of exposure in CBT and also in bereavement counseling, and I will give a little bit more details later on, but I already want to mention it here. Two types of exposure are very critical to fostering this integration of the loss. It's exposure to the story of the loss and exposure to the irreversibility of the separation. So simply said, if people turn to us for help, and if they get stuck in their process of grieving, it's very critical to talk about what exactly happened. And that's something that they tend to avoid, but it helps them to gradually but certainly reconstruct the story of the loss. And it helps them also to talk about the irreversibility of the separation. That's something that people find very difficult. They know that their husband, their son, or others have died. They know rationally that the person will not return, but emotionally they still have a sense that the other will return. So talking about the irreversibility of the loss sounds simple, but it's very critical to grief therapy. Okay, first process, lack of integration of the loss in the memory. The second process postulates that the person has rigid negative cognitions. We know that from other complaints. If you're familiar with the CBT perspective, you know that that perspective postulates that negative, persistent, unhelpful cognitions maintain problems. And that's also something we see in people who get stuck in their grieving. So examples that are on the slides are the type of cognitions that we see in people who get stuck. And this is something, again, this is about therapy. So we use cognitive restructuring with severe cases of PGD, but I would also say don't hesitate using principles of cognitive restructuring in early grief counseling, or well, in care for the acutely bereaved who might be engaging in these negative thinking styles. The third process, so apart from this memory integration, the cognitions, or this module postulates that avoidance behavior maintains problems. So people with PGD or people who are en route to get stuck in their grieving tend to engage in anxious avoidance behavior. They avoid thoughts about the loss, they avoid memories of the circumstances, they avoid stimuli associated with the loss, the scene of the death, photos, talking about the deceased, or talking about the fact that he or she will not return. Or as a little bit of a typical form of avoidance, people may continue to engage in doing things to keep the lost person alive, visit the graveyard 2 times a day or 3 times a day, and pretend, or for themselves, as if the other will return. And from the CBT perspective, one can say, well, these type of cognitions underlie this avoidance behavior. So it's mostly the case that people tend to avoid this stimuli because they fear that they will not be able to bear the pain of the loss. They fear that they will go mad if they confront the reality. And that's what I often see also in working with clients and patients, that they really find it very difficult to really realize what it means to them that their child will not return, or their husband is gone forever. And that drives the avoidance behavior.
And Paul, can I ask something about that?
Yes.
Because you mentioned with the exposure of the reversibility that you should, well, try to show the people that it's over. And
Yeah.
I thought going to a graveyard might be a good way of this exposure, but you're also saying that it's a way of avoidance?
Yeah, good question. So it depends on the function. So people sometimes go to the graveyard, and I had these clients who went there 2 or 3 times a day, not because they were processing the reality of the loss, but because they were maintaining this connection to the deceased as if he or she were still there. So they were avoiding the confrontation with the fact that the person would never return by going to this graveyard.
Yes, it really depends on the function.
Yes, yeah. So if you ask, well, I asked this client, what would happen if you would stop that? If you would go to the graveyard once a day and in 2 weeks only once a week? And this client said, well, I would be able to bear that, or I would be confronted with the fact that she's really gone, that my daughter is really gone, and that would be absolutely unbearable. Going to the graveyard for me is the only way that I feel close to her. So that's then really something that maintains the grief. So apart from anxious avoidance, so this really anxious phobic-like avoidance, people may also engage in this, what we call depressive avoidance, this discontinuation of usual social and recreational activities. And that also is something that maintains the grief. And that is as obvious as it sounds. We know also from working with depressed patients that passivity is an understandable response in the context of depression, but it's also a response that maintains the depression. And the same is true in the context of recovery from loss. So the more inactive people get, the more passive, the more they increase the chance of getting stuck in their grieving process. So graded activation, motivating people to continue valued activities, to go out of the house, to meet with friends, even though they don't feel like doing so. Doing all that, motivating towards activation, is a very critical intervention in therapy, but also in early bereavement care. So some more points of attention for bereavement care. Very, very generally, I think it's always important to identify key symptoms of PGD, PTSD, and depression. What do I mean here? I think a lot of us, or a lot of you, are used to looking at people with the knowledge about PTSD and depression. So we are very aware that people may suffer from PTSD, but we're not always so aware that they also may be suffering from this intense, persistent separation distress. And I would plead for that. If you meet with people who've suffered loss in traumatizing circumstances, also be aware of the grieving. Grieving is not always a healthy thing, or it's a healthy thing, but it's not always has this healthy manifestation. So dare to talk also about this separation distress. I'd say use the term PGD not to say that someone is grieving abnormal. I know the risk of medicalization, etc., but PGD may also be a very comforting and a term that helps people to understand what they're going through. Some have PTSD, but some have this persistent, this prolonged grief disorder. And it helps to use this term. It may also teach people that their responses are intense, but there's good help for them. Another very general advice in bereavement care, in therapy, and counseling is, of course, give room to the story of the loss. It's always good to have people tell about what happened, but it's also good to set boundaries. Some people tend to tell a lot, or to dwell on how wonderful the lost person was. And that's of course fine, but it also may be a form to avoid really talking about the reality of the loss. And in grief therapy, that is something we want to focus on. We really want to talk about the pain of the loss. Be aware of current stressors, of course, is an important point. Involve a supportive person, a friend, a family member, is I think something important to keep in mind. Set clear goals and clarify preconditions. I can imagine that some of you, or in the audience, work in not so common situations, doing online therapy with not so clear rules or boundaries. But I think with grief therapy, it's important to set those clear preconditions. When are you going to do the sessions? How long will they last? What about confidentiality? What will be addressed? What are the goals? What are we going to work on? I think very general things, but good to keep in mind. Talking about goals for therapy, I like to formulate that in a almost like a positive or constructive way. Grief therapy, CBT grief therapy, is not about reducing negative thinking or confronting the pain. I tend to say that the key goals of CBT therapy is to change the unhealthy grieving process into a healing process by working on these 3 tasks: facing and not resisting against the reality of the loss and the implications and the pain, keeping confidence in yourself, other people, life, the future. That's a core task in the grieving process, and trying to re-engage in helpful activities to promote adjustment. So these, I think, are important tasks or goals for grief therapy. Doing this grief therapy from the CBT perspective, we saw that the underpinnings or the basic processes maintaining the grief, this mismatch between the new reality and existing knowledge, chronic negative thought patterns and avoidance behavior. So cognitive therapeutic interventions are focused on integrating this new reality with existing knowledge, changing chronic thoughts, negative thought patterns into helpful cognitions, and changing avoidance behavior into helpful coping behavior. And exposure, and that has become clear in the what I talked about, exposure, cognitive restructuring, and gradual activation are the key interventions there. So exposure, I said something about that. If you want to read more about that, you can distinguish more forms of exposure. Basically, this paper by Geert Smit and me and others, in this paper, we describe different ways in which you can do exposure. I will briefly say a little bit more about 2 forms. What we've called general exposure is always important in the treatment of prolonged grief disorder, but also in grief counseling. What does it constitute? It's about confronting the reality and irreversibility of the separation. Why is this helpful? It's helpful to target or reduce the sense of unrealness, the disbelief, the difficulties to accept the loss that many people with stagnated grief experience. How do you do this? General exposure by using photos, going to places that are connected with the loss if possible, meeting with people and talk to people about the loss and how what the implications are, retrieving memories. Well, anything can be done to foster this confrontation with the reality of the loss. So this general exposure is again a key intervention. Imaginal or prolonged exposure is another subform of exposure. This must sound familiar from treating people with PTSD. Some of our clients, of course, have suffered traumatic circumstances and suffer from horrific images and reliving, re-experiencing of the events that surrounded the loss, and then reconstructing and telling the story of the loss over and over again is a very powerful and good tool to foster the processing. Again, I'd say if your estimation is that that's not only traumatic distress, but also separation distress, you should always combine this with focusing on the loss itself and the grief and the pain and the irreversibility of the loss, but really working through systematically these traumatizing post-traumatic memories is, of course, a very important intervention in CBT treatment for PGD. Just some more remarks about the cognitive restructuring part. We know as good cognitive therapists, we should always search for the unique cognitions that a person is suffering from, trying to identify the key emotions that our person gets stuck in, and then from that move on to identify cognitions. But having said that, we can also say that, well, we also know that some of the belief themes feature prominently in many of our clients. So many of our clients who get stuck in this grief have negative cognitions about themselves, their life, the future, or they engage in these anxiety-provoking catastrophic misinterpretations of their grief. And again, it's my experience from clinical practice that many people have those catastrophic misinterpretations. They're very afraid of really confronting the reality of the loss and really thinking and realizing that their loved one will not be back next week, will not be back in 1 year, and will not be back in 10 years from now. So these affect phobia-like cognitions are, I think, always important to address. Other belief themes, particularly in the case of traumatic losses, suicide, homicide, war-related violence, are themes like safety, trust, self-blame, other blame, and control. So these, it's good to study the possible, or to be aware of the possible negative cognitions that may play a role in the case of your clients and people seeking help. I'm a fan of using simple questionnaires. This is a simple question. It's a long questionnaire, but it's a simple questionnaire. The Grief Cognitions questionnaire is a questionnaire that you can use to have your client check the intensity of a different type of cognitions related with different categories. So if you want to know more about prominent cognitions, maintaining the problems, you can have your client complete this measure. Some general remarks about modifying cognitions. It's good always to search for cognitions that can be falsified. So people with a bereaved or grief, persistent grief, may have a conviction that I am guilty, and that's that's a cognition that's difficult to falsify, or life is meaningless. These are such broad cognitions that it's difficult to falsify them. So it's always good doing cognitive restructuring to reformulate particular prominent cognitions in such terms that you can really talk about them, that you can really falsify them. So I could have prevented the death. It is not a cognition that you can falsify, but a cognition like the fact that I didn't prevent the loss means that I'm a bad person, which is mostly often behind such a I could have prevented the loss cognition. The green one is more easy, not very easy, but more easy to target. Then we can use different conventional good old cognitive restructuring methods to target the cognitions. And I think using behavioral experiments are powerful tools. So if clients have a particular negative prediction, if I arrange to meet with that friend, I will not enjoy it. A prediction like that can best be tested by doing a behavioral experiment. Have your client do something in order to test this prediction. I will skip that for now. Writing assignments are a very powerful tool. They nicely fit in the context or in the framework of CBT and in many other therapeutic framework. I think these are very helpful therapeutic tools to foster the processing of the loss. So first example, an ongoing farewell letter to the deceased. Instruct your client to spend 5 days a week, 30 minutes per day to work on this continued ongoing farewell letter is a very helpful and a good way to canalize the feelings, to express and articulate unfinished business, and also to say goodbye, to take leave. The 3-letter task is a good example of a writing assignment that you can use when there are ambivalent feelings. So sometimes people have a lot of anger towards their deceased person, deceased loved one, but also positive feelings of love. And this all tends to be ambivalent and confusing. And then you can ask your client to write first 2 letters, a positive letter articulating the love, a negative letter articulating the pain and the anger, and finally a 3rd letter in which the different feelings are integrated. So 2 examples of writing assignments that you can easily use in your therapy to foster the processing of the loss at the client's own pace.
And what can you do with the letters? You can just burn it, or you can also do like a ritual with them, or? Good
question. Yeah, again, so rituals, it's on the next slide. These are another group of interventions that you may use. And indeed, doing something with the letter may be a fine ritual. I wouldn't say that it's always you should always have burn the letter, for instance, because a letter can be a wonderful way to cherish the connection with the deceased, for instance. But more broadly, particularly in cases where people have been unable to do rituals that they wanted to do, in cases where people have been unable due to the circumstances to take leave, to do leave-taking rituals, it's very important to talk about the rituals that they still want to do, to say goodbye, to take leave, or to mark transition to a new phase. Very generally, we don't just do rituals because it's so nice. We do rituals for a reason. So it's good to talk with your client. What would be valuable rituals, and what should these rituals mark for you? And often it's a transition to a new life stage without the person, or it's, as I said, a way to take leave and to say goodbye. On the slide, you see a reference to this cultural formulation interview, or the part that Geert Smits, together with others and myself, have developed as an extension add-on to the cultural formulation interview. This is an instrument that you can use to get more insight in these cultural appropriate ways that are helpful to the client to foster the processing. So this supplementary module to the DSM-5 CFI includes 10 open-ended questions to explore the way of grieving and cultural traditions associated with death and bereavement and mourning in the person's culture. So this is also something that you can use in your counseling and therapy at some stage to learn more about the cultural background, and say, I would use this if I would work with Ukrainian clients. I don't know too much about the way, about cultural habits, and I think these are important to address, and this instrument is useful for that. Wendy, you want to ask something?
Yes, I think it's very important to know more about the culture differences. And
Yeah.
I was wondering, do you have any examples for big difference in Africa, or do you have a lot of experience with people from Middle East? Do you have an example for that?
I don't have a lot of experience with that. No, so drawing from my own experience, it's more like a Dutch experience coming to mind. So a person who was, because he was hurt in the accident that took the partner's life, was unable to be at the funeral and to really be present at the funeral. So there we developed this this leave-taking ritual, but it's not a really cultural. It's not a good example based on the CFI. So I
know that some cultures, when there is someone lost, they have like black clothes for 1 year, something like that, when you are a widow. So that's really different in different cultures. So and maybe you can, Ala, maybe you can, in the end, maybe you can think about maybe typical Ukraine traditional. We can think about it. Please continue.
Yes, one other association is with an African, and I formulate this very broadly, but with an African patient who was, because he fled war and left behind his parents who were murdered, was unable to bury them properly. So he rapidly buried them and fled. And afterwards, he set up, all possibilities to go back and to rebury his parents, because the burial and making this good grave and the ceremony surrounding it was really very critical to this person grieving process. So rather than doing a lot of therapy, we did a lot about, trying to arrange the possibility for him to go back to the country to do this reburial of his parents. So this is an example coming to mind. So this supplementary model of the CFI may be useful for that. I would scroll through it if I were you, and if you were interested. You don't have to use all questions in a very structured way, but you can use some of the 10 questions to also, to get more of an impression of the way your client is grieving. So EMDR, it's just two very general remarks as I move towards the end of my talk. EMDR, I'd say, can be used as one of the interventions among other interventions and not a standalone treatment. I know that some people will disagree. Some people will say, well, you can use EMDR perfectly for a prolonged grief disorder. Based on literature and research, it has been studied in the context of other interventions and not as a standalone treatment. I'd say, well, it's indicated particularly when people are intensely plagued by traumatic distress connected with specific images. So then EMDR may be a very helpful additional treatment intervention to reduce the burden of those re-experiences. Dealing with non-bereavement loss, which is obviously a topic in itself, and that, well, we could spend a couple of webinars to carefully address that. But just some broad comments. I don't do the topic right, of course, but I do want to say something about it. There are similarities between mourning and grieving the death of a loved one and mourning and grieving other losses, the loss of your home country, the community, loss of perspective, loss of health. And very broadly said, you can say, well, facilitating a healthy grieving process also in these cases of non-bereavement loss can be done or can be fostered by, again, focusing on these three tasks. So I think it's important, irrespective of the specific nature of the loss, that people face and see the reality of the loss and really articulate and formulate and be aware of the implications of the loss and all the consequences the loss brings. So that's, I think, always important. If people get stuck in grieving for whatever loss, it's important to really talk about reality and tease apart the implications of what happened. Trying to keep confidence in yourself, other people, life, the future is also something in the case of non-bereavement loss that's is a good and important target for therapy. And even more so, perhaps, engaging in helpful activities to promote adjustment to the new situation, which I know sounds so simple and it's much more difficult to do. And it's easier said than done, of course. But in bereavement therapy or counseling for non-bereavement loss, this is very important to focus on, to encourage the person to engage or re-engage in valued activities, to go out of the house if possible, to search and connect with friends and family members as far as possible. Even though the person don't want to, of course, that's something that's so understandable if you're suffered loss and trauma, etc. But activating a person is, I think, always important to do as far as we can in counseling and therapy. Is there time, or should we, Wendy, to say briefly, a couple of things about the effects?
I think it's we have some time, yes, and they're also coming up with a few questions, but they can we can put them to the end.
Okay. Just a summary of some of the studies that have been done and some of the conclusions that can be drawn from those studies testing different interventions. Exposure and cognitive restructuring are effective. That's shown in studies. We compared this CBT approach with non-directive supportive counseling. So very supportive only, not addressing cognitions, not addressing avoidance. And CBT was more effective. In further studies, for instance, in Australia, they found that particularly this element of exposure, and exposure doesn't have to be crude and brutal and firm, and can be done very elegantly, but really focusing on the reality of the loss, focusing on the pain by means of exposure, general exposure, prolonged exposure, is a very powerful ingredient of therapy. And Richard Bryant in Australia compared it with cognitive restructuring. This exposure is in fact even more powerful, more important than the cognitive restructuring part. There was this nice study in America by Anthony Papa and colleagues who focused on activation only, not talking about the loss, no exposure, but only trying to activate, reconnect with personal values. And they found that this was also a treatment that has had promising effects. encouragingly, there are increasing numbers of studies which have shown that doing CBT interventions via the internet using structured writing assignments is also very effective. If you're interested in CBT or in treatment for prolonged grief disorder, you shouldn't miss the work by Kathy Shear. She did a couple of studies on complicated grief treatment, again with these CBT elements, but some additional features, including psychodrama techniques like an imaginary conversation with the deceased, tested in several wonderful studies and found to be quite effective. Another interesting study, I think, was this one by Brett Litz and a couple of other colleagues. They provided CBT interventions to people who had elevated PGD symptomatology as early as 3 to 6 months following loss, so really elevated suffering early in the grieving process. And they found that administering CBT interventions had a significant and considerable preventative impact on later complaints. Among the many things that we're doing, work is underway supporting the positive impact of early CBT interventions online without therapist guidance. So if you're interested, you may consult or look at this preprint on PsychArchive, how do you pronounce that, in which we did this RCT on unguided online treatment. And one of the projects we've been trying to set up is also to translate this into Ukrainian and Russian together with some colleagues from Ukrainian background. So to see if this can be helpful to some other people who suffered loss. Here there are 2 studies we did in which we combined cognitive therapy with EMDR. In one study we did on people victims of the MH17 plane crash, we had a puzzling finding that cognitive therapy and EMDR had limited effects. We don't know exactly why. In another study we did on homicidally bereaved patients, we also looked at cognitive therapy and EMDR. This combination was effective. We also compared CT, cognitive therapy, and EMDR, and then we found that both parts of therapy were equally effective, which is commonly found in studies in which EMDR is compared to some other treatment intervention. But still, it's at the very least, it shows that it's encouraging outcomes of this study to apply EMDR combined with other interventions. And today I didn't say anything yet about children, but one other thing we did was a study in which he applied the same interventions in a for children and adolescents, of course, altered and adjusted to what's appropriate for children. And we found that interventions were also effective in alleviating the stagnated prolonged grief in children and adolescents. So that's something you can find in the American Journal of Psychiatry if you want to know more about that. Conclusions and final remarks. Many people are resilient in the face of loss. I said resilience. I'm not the biggest fan of the term. It's more like stable, healthy functioning. But still, loss can lead to severe emotional distress in a significant minority. Be aware of PGD. So not all grief is healthy and normal. So don't be hesitant also to address the intensity of grief and to rule out that people are suffering from PGD. Many interacting variables inflate the risk of emotional distress. It's important and helpful to map them out with your clients, what's going on, what happened, what are risk factors in this individual case that inflate the grief. I hope to have illustrated that CBT you can easily use that in different contexts for different types of clients with different types of problems and different severities. I wouldn't be too hesitant to use exposure and principles of cognitive restructuring and also activation. Again, and that's the second bullet. Note CBT is not focused on taking away the pain. It's sometimes thought that that's what CBT does. It's focused on really strengthening the processing. Of course, you can use video conferencing, and some of us have been doing that since Corona, and some of you have been continue doing that because you're not in your home country. And this can be, well, this also brings extra options and opportunities to do creative forms of exposure. We wrote a paper in Journal of Loss and Trauma with some tips and advices about how you can use the techniques and possibilities of video conferencing in your CB3. More information via rouw.arc.org, and it's all Dutch, rouwbehandeling.nl. We are at the start of starting this process, this small project in which we are at the very least want to translate the material we've been developing in Ukrainian and Russian, and to make the material available to people who are interested in it and want to work with that. So keep an eye on those websites, or email me whenever you want to hear about the progress of these projects. That's it.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm really impressed by, well, everything you learned us. For me, a lot was quite new, actually. And there's some time left for questions. And
yeah, there is also one question for Alla. I think it's Ukraine or Russian. So.
Yeah, it's Ukraine, and it's written that the questions concerning cultural difference are very important, and even a huge difference between the approaches to treat and to work with these people due to these differences. Like statement is not a question.
Can I ask a question? Because Alla, it's a difficult question, but can you say something about key, perhaps cultural differences in grieving between, say, the Dutch people and Ukrainian people? I know it's an impossibly
maybe I will say, thank you, Paul, the difference between Israelis and Ukrainians, for me, it's more closer because I'm working with them a lot of time. For instance, in Israel, they have the tradition that they buried the person who passed away on the first day, and then they're staying for 5 or 7 days at home, and a lot of friends, relatives, colleagues, they are coming to this person and say their condolence. So this is not for religion people, for normal Israelis, I mean. Sorry, for people who are not religion, maybe it will be more correct. In Ukrainian, we have such tradition. We bury the person who passed away as soon as we prepare, it maybe in 2 days and 3 days, it doesn't matter. And then we have some obligatory tradition that on the 9th day and on the 40th day, the relatives, they gathered all people who were in touch with this person, and we sitting in the table, we eating, drinking, and saying something positive, how we remind him, how what we know, something interesting or something that were only hours connected with this person. So it's some kind of a round table where people are eating. We prepared some special food, some cakes, some sweets. It's obligatory. And then the original food for people to drink, some alcohol, and it's our tradition, and eating. And we're talking about this person.
Interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I have also a question: when someone lost someone in the war, there is a big aggressor. Is that different? Because then you have an aggression like a war or Russian, and I can imagine that when there is an aggressor, it's also interfere in some way, maybe.
Yeah. So what I think, it's of course it will inflate the anger and the rage and also the powerlessness, feelings like that. and it's obvious to say, but it's good to make space for that and have people articulate those feelings, and then also to be aware that it may eventually turn into avoidance, because people may get stuck in this anger and rage and towards the aggressor, whereas in the end they also have to process the loss of their child or husband. So it's good to make space for the rage and the other blame and the anger, but also to balance it with focusing on the reality of the loss. And is it an answer? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question, or actually a remark from Maxime, and it says that I think it's more difficult to pass grief when person does not know exactly how their beloved one died, and when they don't see the body again because of war, for instance.
Yeah.
Is that something that maybe caused in the study on the plane crash, that you didn't find effects on the CBT? Does it have to do with? Oh.
Yeah, I was. I don't know why the MH70 study turned out the way it did. I think it's because the people had gotten quite some other help as well, which may have interfered with the help that we gave. But of course, it's the situation where many people, didn't have intact body remains to take leave from. Sometimes people had different, in different stages that loved ones returned or remains, awful situations, and then people repeatedly took leave from remains of their loved ones, or but still I'm thinking of situations in which people are confronted with suicidal death, which sometimes the body is severely injured, and then still people want to, if possible, want to see the body of the person. They really want to see with their own eyes that the other person is dead, and want to take leave of the body. And of course, if that's impossible because the body is gone or damaged or what, then it's of course an extra traumatizing or difficult element of the grieving process.
Yeah, it's also a question from Maxime, because when it is wartime, it's very difficult to do the cultural traditions. So that's also complicated, I think, in the whole process.
Yeah. So when there's time for therapy of counseling, talking about those cultural traditions and trying to find ways to redo those in if possible, or to some extent, or that's tremendously important for the grieving process. Yeah. But of course, there are instances in which it's entirely impossible. But
and I can also imagine, because there are also a lot of Ukraine psychologists listening right now, and when they are doing like a grief counseling, that's also really connect, and it's close to your own feelings of losses, or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know, Ella, do you recognize things in counseling and your own private about losses?
It's complicated question, you know. Yeah, it's complicated even in this time. But if you don't mind, I would like to translate the questions in the chat. Yeah. Yes. One person write that it's really truth that every region of Ukraine, even in the eastern part of Ukraine, they have the different traditions concerning the bereavement, and it's very important to keep these traditions. And the next, what I would like to say, and then it is written in the chat, that now in Ukraine we have a new tradition when the person in this, the hero, the soldiers that were killed in this war, his coffin, it comes to his place, the people are staying on their knees. It's some, the street of people from the both sides, they are staying on their knees and on their knees, and it's some, and even they have, even there are some people who are crying, in order to have such atmosphere, and some special songs when they are crying concerning the person who were killed in this war.
And is that also when you do like a community, like you there you are sitting all together in the village when the soldier is coming home, something I would say, and you do it together? Is that also like the connection between the community? Is that also healthy or important? Do you think so? Or Anna?
Yes, of course, it's important because, when you're alone and you are crying, the support of the community, it's the thing that help you in your emotional state, because that the first emotional aid, if you receive this first emotional aid, it helps you to mitigate this PTSD, not PTSD, maybe some stress disorders or PTSD, depends on it. So it's very, very important.
There's a question from Maria, and she's asking, how can we help Russian clients and their families in Holland who cannot go to their families in Russia also in this period? They have a mix of shame, missing mourning, have a different look at themselves and their homelands that gives a lot of uncertainty, unrest, and sadness.
It's a big question and good. My first thoughts are disentangling, teasing apart the different feelings, and if people suffered loss and wherever they come from Russian or somewhere else, and they want help, it's good to give help and to help them understand their grieving process. And of course but it's accompanied by shame and stigma, and that's, you have to tease that apart and address that too, that interacts with the grieving and may make people more ashamed of their grieving process and to hide their grieving. So there are different topics to address there, but still also address the pain of those people, the separation distress that those people suffer.
Yeah, maybe this question is connected. There are a lot of people missing how to cope with this loss. Yeah, when do you, because you mentioned that exposure is important, that then people should really face the loss, but how about those missing people?
In the case of missing people, it's more about that. People have hope. People hold on to hope that the person will return. And it's not something you take away as a caretaker. So you give space to the hope, but on the other hand, you also talk about the scenario that the other person will not come back. So it's more like this two-track process of keeping in mind, well, you have to process the possibility that the other will never return. And on the other hand, you also have to learn to live with the uncertainty and perhaps the hope that the other will return. And that's, of course, puts again another dimension to the grieving process. And talk about, exposure to these circumstances, talk about what people think that it has happened. So sometimes people have all scenarios and ideas and that they don't want to articulate, or they are fearful to talk about. And it's good to talk about all the scenarios that people have in their heads. And also the scenario that the person is really dead. Yeah.
Thank you. Alay, did you see all or translated all the questions?
Ukrainian? In the chat.
There are 4.
No, I don't see Ukrainian, only English. I see Ukrainian that when the people are staying on the knees, it's some kind of glory for a person who died in this horrible war.
but it was written in English.
Yeah, so there's a
Do
question
you
from
see something like
Natalia. Have you seen that?
Ukrainian?
Yeah,
I don't see Ukrainian question.
it's in the chat. It's put there by Natalia, but maybe you already mentioned that question.
I think so.
Yeah. And
I
then
think so.
Yeva
NZ, maybe
Yeah.
Natalia. Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
She's talking about this tradition, when person
yeah,
is
sorry.
generally okay.
Just checking. I think we went through all the questions that are there, and I think it's also time, so maybe it's a good moment to finish.
But one more questions, questions and key. You see, how can we help Russian clients and their families in Holland who cannot go to their family in Russia also in this period? They have a mix of shame, missing, mourning, have a different look at themselves and their homeland that gives a lot of uncertainty, unrest, and sadness.
Yeah, we went through this question. Paul already answered this question. No, you were translating, I think, the other questions at that point. So I think we went through it all.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. It was very important and very interesting. Yes,
Can I have one question to Paul?
Yeah.
I have a lot of questions from my clients when they're asked about the rules or maybe some information when it is okay to take the kids to the funeral ceremony, from what ages it is normal to take a kids to the funeral ceremony. What did you say?
I can think that is, well, that depends in different cultural groups or subgroups. I would say at whatever age children, well, at all ages actually, and involve kids in bereavement and grieving rituals and funeral rituals, if possible. So children can handle a lot, and if you can explain what happens, and I think it's very helpful for them to be involved in that. And of course, it depends on who, particularly when it's a close family member. I'd say, if possible, keep get the kids to be present.
Yeah,
so am I right? It depends on how family or mothers prepared the person to this funeral ceremony, how she supports her, because sometimes it's scared for kids from 5 or 6 years old.
Yeah, so good preparation is important, but still, children are generally also very resilient and able. Now I use the term, but able to engage in such ceremonies. It's not easy, but they're generally very curious also to see and to hear what happens. And if you explain and if you give room to their questions before and afterwards and monitor their feelings also a month later and time later, then I think it's very fine to involve them in the bereavement and grieving rituals, particularly when it's the mother or father or a very close person who died. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
This word seems to me united all people in the world like such net that support Ukrainians, and it's very touchful and sensitive for us. Thank you so much for your support.
Well, it's a pleasure.